We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Hello and welcome to The Interruption, the Global Institute for Tomorrow podcast. Today we're recording from our headquarters in Hong Kong, where I'm sitting with GIFT founder Chandran Nair. Today's topic is, of course, on the coronavirus outbreak, but we're going to look at what's gone well. How have countries responded, and what approaches have actually been effective? In developing a global response to pandemics for the future, we must learn from the current coronavirus outbreak now. So Chandran, I'll hand over to you. What responses have you seen from across the world, and which ones have proven effective?
Thank you. Well, we have seen a mixture of responses. I think the news, which all of us are following because we've got so much time in our hands, is very clear. We're seeing mixed responses. None of us take pleasure in seeing responses which essentially are inadequate, but clearly we seek reassurances from where responses have been good. And I wrote a piece 2 weeks ago saying what are the common features of places where things have essentially been managed. No place is perfect, but most of the places where things have been managed well so far have been essentially in Asia, partly because that's where it started. But at the same time, we're very fortunate that in those places in Asia where it started, the governments reacted very quickly. Yes, there has been criticism of China, etc., but most of us should not forget that the first place where it starts is often the most difficult, because those leaders never know what this is going to look like. People forget the mad cow disease in the UK, which is, I think, about 20 years ago or more, and there was complete mayhem in the UK. But fortunately, it was not a disease that then crossed international borders. So what we've seen is China took draconian steps, and I think most of the world should be very thankful they did. And then we've seen Hong Kong, in the midst of political unrest, get organized. And I'm happy to talk about what get organized looks like, which goes beyond the government clamps down, but actually people getting organized. And then we saw the exemplary methods and responses from places like Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. What is really sad to see is that the old country, Europe, was not equipped for this, except perhaps now we're seeing in Germany, where again I would happy to reflect on what I talked about in my book, which is the state there being very strong. That not meaning an authoritarian state, but a state where the social contract between people who understand discipline, etc., and the difference between the UK, where it has become very clear, and even the prime ministers, various politicians, and now even football stars, begging people to behave and stay at home, which is not the case in Germany, because people understand the social contract and the rules. And of course, the most telling thing in the last 2 weeks has been the absolute chaos in the US, both in terms of what people thought would be the ability of a country that is able to go to war so readily, but yet is not able to function at a local level. Partly as a result of the politics, where there's consistent politicking by both the federal and the state level, and then also the nature of the free market and the way industry operates, which has shown starkly across the world that the most advanced economy in the world can't get its act together, even in relation to producing enough ventilators for a population that is crying out for intervention.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what then do you mean, referring back to your earlier point about Germany, do you mean by a strong state in the context of coronavirus? And that's a point I think you can expand upon a bit.
Well, the way to look at that would be to look at, when people talk about a strong state, and in my book, The Sustainable State, when I refer to the strong state, they immediately jump to the conclusion that I'm talking about authoritarianism. Authoritarianism may be needed at this juncture. In most countries, what we are seeing is authoritarianism, basically government imposing order. That is called authority imposing itself. So authoritarianism should not be seen as a bad word. The abuse of authority is, of course, not a good thing, and is relative based on the demands of any one time. But let's not kid ourselves. At this point, in one of the greatest crises that humanity has faced in the last 100 years or so, you are going to need order and collective welfare before individual rights, and therefore you need authoritarian systems in place. So in Germany, it's interesting to see, and the point I make, but is often missed, is that authoritarianism doesn't need to come from authority imposing itself, and that need not be the only means by which it manifests itself. It also comes from the fact that the institutions, which are more widespread, have a social contract. The authority, the bodies are respected by the population. People understand and therefore behave accordingly. So in Germany, what I meant by this is that the German public understands what the role of the state is in a situation like this. It respects its authority. It respects its competence as well. And it respects that there is a contract here that needs to be observed if the collective welfare of the nation is to be protected. That was very different in the initial days, unfortunately, in Italy or in the UK. And it's certainly even to this day in the UK, in the US, not the same. I mean, there are images today going on, being shared on the internet of beaches in Florida being open, and people are arguing that they have a right to go anywhere. So that's a failure of authority, in my view. It puts collective welfare at risk. So that's the difference. In China, there is a state that is omnipotent and very forceful and strong. Some argue it's repressive, but at the same time took a very clear decision, unprecedented decision in modern times, to close down a province with over 50 million people. Who would take that decision? And take it at a very early stage. Countries today are taking that decision because they learned from China. But that state, whilst being very strong and being able to enforce, also had a society which understood, and I would argue from a civilizational point of view, that order was important in the midst of great danger and chaos. And therefore, in that society, there were very few transgressions. And maybe I'll finish by saying that saw something a couple of weeks ago that said in the first 6 days or so of the French lockdown, there was something like over 10,000 transgressions of the order to stay at home. And in China, there's hardly any. Now, some would argue, those who want to criticize China, that the Chinese system was essentially unforgiving when you did something like that. But 11,000 and 0, look between those extremes, and I think you will see that there's a very different understanding of what order looks like, who's responsible for order, what is the role of the state, and what is the social contract. And the underpinning of that, which is very uncomfortable for those who like to think that authority comes with authoritarianism, but the underpinning of that is a society that understands. And those societies that understand are now proving to be the ones that are essentially fairer and are going to essentially ride the storm.
Mm. It's interesting what you say. It sounds like those who understand or have a certain view of social norms that are adhering to the institutional objectives that are being put toward the population are actually responding better. So in China's case, it sounds like what you're saying is that the population has more trust in their institutions.
Yes.
So how would we go about building more trust in institutions and also having more effective institutions as a whole?
Well, you don't go around building it only. You have to earn the trust. I mean, that's the cliche too. Of course, you have to earn the trust. The irony at the moment is the United States looks like a place in which actually people don't trust their governments. And not only don't people don't trust their governments, they feel they are individual and they have a right to exercise whatever privileges they want. But not only that, the political system has to be one in which there is unity of purpose, in which therefore there is unity, and then people trust that the institutions are unified. So it's interesting to see the New York governor over the weekend, in fact, suggests that the president, and whether it's Donald Trump, or whether you like him, or whether it's someone else, but the president of the United States has no right to essentially issue a quarantine notice on the state, right? So when you have this kind of bickering, then essentially a state is weakened, because you have so many, as you put in terms of failed states, so many warlords. So, and then you even have the New York governor threatening to sue a neighboring state if they would essentially prevent car owners from New York to drive into the state. So you can't have unity. So to your question, how do you build it? Well, first you build it because you have a structure that has earned the trust of the people over time. Tested not through essentially crisis, but tested through the day-to-day work that is carried out to build a better society. So, those of us who go to Japan or Germany, I will use Japan as an example, is often criticized for its weak government and this and that. But it's a very, very different system Japan works. And Japan works not because of, mayors and prime ministers yelling and shouting or using different methods to impose their order. But Japan works because of the quiet work every day of the institutions of the government, the institutions of the communities, and the institutions within the sort of underbelly of the society, which is very, very subtle and needs people to look at. And for me, that emblem of that how Japan works is, if anyone's been in Japan, is to know how the waste disposal system at the smallest community level works, and where the 78-year-old lady is waiting at a certain time on a certain day, and you better bring your waste there and have it in the right bags and properly cleaned before you put it in the container. And that's how you build that. That's day in and day out. You could almost say it's civilizational. It takes time. But it requires some respectful obedience too, which again is not a word that is fashionable in liberal societies, right? So obedience, authority, those things are critical elements of building that sort of society.
It sounds like when you say institution, it spans scales. We're not just talking about governments, we're not just talking about universities, but we're talking about local communities as well.
Yes.
And the depth and importance of these institutions is clearly important for how coronavirus has been addressed in Asia, and perhaps how it hasn't been addressed in Europe and the US. So going forward, do you think that coronavirus is maybe the start of a shift in these countries towards stronger institutions? Do you think it's revealed certain weaknesses that will be addressed?
Well, I think it probably in the countries in Asia reinforced a belief in that need for authority and obedience, and that trickles down into beyond the ministry for transport, or the ministry for healthcare, right into the communities, etc. But there's no substitution for the frameworks. You have to have the frameworks, and those frameworks are not done by companies or small communities. Communities can have their own frameworks, but they essentially operate within the arch of what the nation state believes should be the norm and the expectations. Now, will this be a game changer in the Western democracies? I am not so sure. We will see. But will there be lessons learned in Europe from how Germany works? One hopes so. But Germany has worked well for a long time, yet it has always been begrudgingly respected in Europe. So we will see. Will it change the way the UK works? We don't know. We will see. But there is evidence that people are begrudging of this role of the state. Yet people do expect the state to do things for them, but you should not infringe in my right to enjoy myself. That's the other really interesting thing about this. It's about a view in certain societies, and I'm going to be general here and say that particularly in richer democratic liberal societies, there's almost obsession with my right to and privilege to have a good time. Whereas in other societies, I think there's a different notion. If I have to stay home at 2 weeks, I'll find different ways of having a good time. And my God, if I don't have a good time, it's not the end of the world for 2 weeks. But in other societies, and I think you will know that in the UK, I think for the first week or so, there was this big discussion about, my God, we can't go to the pub. This is not a conversation in Korea. And this is certainly not a conversation in Singapore. Who cares? So those are really interesting things, I think, about the underbelly of the society and people's feelings about their rights. It's very interesting that these rights are quite often skewed towards, I have a right to a good time. Rather than, will my good time, or me having a good time, infringe on others, noise, etc., or even risk worsening an epidemic. So we will see. But at the same time, there are lots of proclamations that the world will change. A lot of it seems to be, in my view, economics, working from home, role of technology. But they haven't really talked about the more narcissistic elements of societies that have become so modern in their outlook, yet have forgotten what the real world looks like, right? And there is a sort of certain irony in the fact that social distancing, which is the word of our time, is seen as something that is difficult to do in countries, not the most crowded places in the world. So, Europe is not the most crowded place in the world. Hong Kong is one of the most crowded places in the world. Yet this society, despite all the political problems we've had, has managed to find a way to behave and practice an element of social distancing despite the density issues. But the reality is, in urban areas, in the poor parts of the world, social distancing is not possible. So try going and living in Dhaka, Nigeria, in Lagos, or in Delhi or Mumbai, in the poor areas, and see what social distancing looks like. So I would argue that there will be great differences, but hopefully there will be an understanding by governments that they have to build these institutions and they have to earn the trust. But in the Western world, they'll have to understand that freedoms are not unfettered and they come at a price. And